This is a post-event recording of a lecture delivered to the University of the Arts London on April 23, 2024. It is titled, "The Office is a Machine for Working In." In Le Corbusier's 1927 manifesto, Towards an Architecture, the architect famously characterized the house as une machine à habiter, a machine for living in. People could, and have, written long and complicated essays and articles arguing over what a machine for living in really means. But to save us all some tortuous reading, I think by looking at Corbusier's designs for private houses, we can get a clearer and more physical sense of what he meant. In the Villa Savoy, for example, we see a building equipped with cutting-edge modern comforts and technologies located within an otherwise sparsely decorated space. Where there are what could be considered architectural ornaments, like this ramp or this skylight, the function of these features seems in many ways to overshadow their aesthetic impact. The ramp's primary goal is to allow for movement between floors, and the skylight we see here serves first and foremost to provide light in an otherwise unilluminated central room. Through his architecture and through his words, Corbusier is arguing that the function and efficacy of the home must take center stage, that at the end of the day, good houses, quote unquote, are designed primarily or entirely around their ability to facilitate the day-to-day functions of living in an orderly, efficient, technologically advanced manner. I think the sort of framework Corbusier sets up, the way he's looking at the underlying forces behind architecture and the needs of these spaces, can be pretty helpful in unpacking and understanding the space of the office. This is why I'm suggesting to you today, in roughly Corbusier's words, that the office is a machine for working in. Over the next 35 minutes or so, I'm going to make the case that the underlying reason for the office's existence as a space is to facilitate work and to extract labor and through it value and profit from the individuals working inside these spaces. To make this argument, I'm first going to start with a little background information, the story or narrative of the history of office spaces as you will generally find it out in the wild. I'll hold a critical magnifying glass to this narrative and make the case for why I think it's almost completely wrong. From there, I'll suggest a new way we can understand the history of the office through the lens of labor and work, and leave you with some implications of this new way of looking at office spaces on your practice as interior designers. So, with that, let's jump in. Despite the lengthy history of office spaces and the incredibly large and perhaps even oversized role which offices have played and which continue to play in the lives of hundreds of millions of people around the world, there's surprisingly little written about the office. If you've tried to do research on the office, you've probably stumbled upon the same core group of books and authors being mentioned, cited, and trotted out again and again. Frank Duffy and his 1997 book, The New Office, Nikhil Saval's 2014 Cubed, Caruso St. John Architect's 2017 book, Office on the Grass, and more recently, Jennifer Kaufman-Buehler's work on the Open Office. If you dig a little further, you might find Australian cricket commentator Gideon Hayes' giant 2012 book, The Office, A Hardworking History, or Jurjen van Meel's 2000 book, The European Office. This literature on office spaces is notable for another reason beyond its scarcity, and that's its consistency. Articles and books on the history of the office all sort of seem to say the same thing. They detail a history from the birth of the office through to today, which uses roughly the same case studies to divide historical offices into roughly the same eras, demarcated by, again, roughly the same aesthetics, ideologies, and technologies. Through its consistent message, the body of writing on the history of the office has shaped a narrative of what office spaces have been, why they were this way, what they are like now, and what these spaces should or could be in the future. In turn, this narrative has been read, picked up, and repeated by lots more people, by architects, designers, journalists, management consultants, corporate management, and general commentators on office work and office space. The narrative of office history generally begins at the turn of the 20th century, with the birth of the commercial office as we know it today. Based on business historian Alfred Chandler's work, architectural histories of the office tend to suggest that as the scale of businesses grew, so too did the volume of accompanying paperwork. With more paperwork came more workers and thus a need for a space in which these individuals could toil. Frank Lloyd Wright's Larkin Administration Building is frequently used as an example of the early office, since the space has almost all of the era's hallmarks. It has wide open spaces with very little individual privacy, identical furnishings, and an interior design shaped almost entirely around efficiency. Within the Larkin, everything from the chairs cantilevered from the desks to the skylights and the arrangement of desk accessories was designed to increase the speed at which paperwork could be completed and moved around the building. These spaces were, according to the literature, openly and brazenly based around Frederick Taylor's principles of scientific management, aiming to openly extract maximum productivity from workers through command and control strategies. From here, the literature suggests that offices, alongside the scope of capitalism, continued to grow, frequently ever upward, with office spaces occupying the vast majority of new buildings like the Empire State Building and the RCA Building in Rockefeller Plaza. While the exterior architecture of the offices of the 1920s and 30s may have changed from relatively short buildings in the preceding decades to the era's signature skyscrapers, the interiors of these buildings, we're told, looked quite similar to those of the turn of the 20th century. Workers were still situated at identical desks in neat, orderly, open offices, where interior design was utilized to encourage faster, more streamlined work practices. The narrative of office history suggests that, constricted by the available technology, office design stayed relatively static all the way until the middle of the 20th century. In the 1950s and 60s, supported by the development of better elevator, ventilation, and materials technologies, offices, according to the narrative again, started to become wider, deeper, less regimented, and more modern. I could, and in fact have, given whole lectures on the offices of this time period, which make up some of the most referenced and famous buildings in history. Here we're thinking about Mies van der Rohe's Segram Building, Gordon Bunshaft's Lever House, and Eero Saarinen's Bell Labs, General Motors, and John Deere headquarters, which are all seen as emblematic of the mid-century office and of mid-century architecture and design more broadly. During the mid-century, improvements to elevators meant that higher buildings were more practical and more affordable in more places than ever before. Sophisticated central heating and cooling technologies also allowed buildings to grow further upward, since opening windows were no longer needed to regulate temperature. HVAC systems also meant that building floor plans could be deeper, again because employees no longer needed to sit near a window to cool off in hot summer months. Architectural histories suggest that alongside basic layout changes to the floor plates of offices, developments in materials technology also freed architects from conventional building designs and gave rise to the glass curtain, the ability to design a building around large walls of glass, letting in more light and providing more panoramic and beautiful views than ever before. Inside these glass-walled buildings, new materials were mobilized to make the office more comfortable and more like home. Designers added brightly colored polyester upholstered chairs and sofas to workplaces, alongside bent ply and molded plastic desk furniture and softer, more directed task lighting. Through all of these changes, the narrative of office history suggests to us that mid-century offices were beginning to look a lot more like an upper middle-class house than an office building. These spaces were comfortable, trendy, colorful, soft, and modern. Writers on office history argue that these changes came about as a result of newly popular ideas about what the workplace should be, emphasizing the Schnell brothers' Bürolandschaft concept and Douglas MacGregor's theory Y of management. Theory Y suggested that office workers of the mid-century were different than those before them, that the work they were doing was more complex, and that as a result, workers needed to be managed differently. Instead of being told what exactly they should be doing, workers should be softly managed within Theory Y, allowed space for individual processes, and provided with the tools workers needed to do their work well. Bürolandschaft, which, if you can't guess by the name, was a German creation, made the ideas of Theory Y physical. By breaking up the straight, orderly lines of the office and landscaping desks into complicated patterns, Bürolandschaft suggested it could both empower workers and engineer collaboration through casual interaction. From some of the most famous buildings in the history of architecture, the common history of the office usually makes a slight detour at this point to talk about a furniture system rather than a building proper. And that system is Herman Miller's 1968 Action Office. Action Office was and remains a modular furniture system designed specifically for office spaces. The design centered around sets of upholstered panel dividers which could be easily set up, relocated, and removed by workers without the need for specialist installers. The narrative of office history suggests that emerging from mid-century design sensibilities, technological advancements, and changes to ideologies of management, Action Office redefined what an office was and could be by introducing modularity and flexibility to a previously static, fixed space. The narrative of office history continues, telling us that as white-collar work became more driven by technology in the 1990s, it also became more creative and complicated, necessitating even more face-to-face contact between collaborating employees. Exemplified by spaces such as Gaetano Pesce's blindingly chaotic 1994 Chiat Day New York headquarters, office spaces of the turn of the 21st century supposedly began to break down conventional work patterns, reinventing and reinvigorating the design of the office in the process. At Chiat Day New York, workers had no permanent workstation. Instead, they were expected to keep any and all personal belongings in lockers and move about and throughout the space as needed for the different sorts of tasks they did each day. Within the turn of the 21st century office, anything could be a workstation. For example, the image on the screen right now isn't a cafeteria or a break room, but instead a functioning part of the office proper, a space where employees were expected to get their normal day-to-day work done. And if you're feeling this sort of design and like the vibe and happen to have a spare 2,000 to 3,000 pounds lying around, you would have been able to bid on a door from this space several years ago. Finally, we're told by many authors that the office has reached its peak, its zenith, with the headquarters of today's tech giants like Google, Facebook, Amazon, Twitter, Apple, and perhaps soon TikTok, which feature every conceivable amenity under the sun to make the workspace as comfortable and as enticing as possible. Free food and drink, video games, foosball, juice bars, gyms, childcare, dry cleaning, even heated toilet seats. You name it, and these spaces likely have it. Beyond amenities, the commonly told history of the office argues that the cavernous and uninterrupted floor plans of contemporary office spaces have been designed to facilitate maximum interaction and teamwork. They argue this sort of space is necessary for knowledge workers to collaborate, share ideas, and solve increasingly difficult and complex work problems together. The office of the 21st century, in the commonly told narrative, is again the zenith of office design, the pinnacle of comfort, of technological sophistication and efficiency. We're told that by the present day, architects, designers, and managers have figured everything out, that these spaces are as comfortable and human-oriented as possible, that they're more like home than home, and that everything and anything has been thought of and addressed to make work happen as quickly and easily as possible. Taking a step back, we can see that Frank Duffy, Nikhil Saval, Caruso St. John architects, and many other authors writing about the history of the office have crafted what might be called a narrative of progress, a story of office history which evolves steadily and positively over time, from the browbeating, controlling, rigid spaces of the early 20th century, like the Larkin Building, to the almost paradise-like office spaces of today. And on the surface, the story that these authors are telling seems pretty convincing. Other spaces have changed a lot, and for the better, over the past 120 years, so offices must have too, right? And of course, undeniably, over the past 120 years, a lot of things have changed within office spaces. Computers have replaced pen and paper, plastic has replaced metal and wood, and general styling has absolutely changed with popular trends. But despite these specific changes, if we take another look at the images of offices throughout history, even the ones used within the narratives of progress, I think we can see a very different story emerging. If we take another look at some of the images I used in my historical overview a few minutes ago, for example, suddenly the office of the turn of the 19th century can look a whole lot like the office of the mid-20th century and the offices of the 21st century. While typewriters and papers have been replaced with laptops and latte machines, the basing overarching architecture of office spaces has remained the same. And that's wide open spaces with limited personal privacy for average workers and cellularized private rooms for management. So I want to suggest to you today that the history of the office can be better described as one of continuity, of the same basic design, the open office, being repeated again and again throughout history. And in the rare instances where offices in this history do get changed for the better, these changes don't seem to stick around for very long. Take, for example, Action Office, a space lauded by its designer Robert Probst as revolutionizing the office, making the space human and flexible, making it functional and cater to the individual worker. Despite all of Propst's best intentions for the system, as his product gained more and more traction in the marketplace, and as it began to be bought by and adopted by more and more companies, it steadily lost many of its human and personal features. Bright colors were replaced by grays, partition walls grew taller and were fixed into place, and instead of offices filled with different implementations and configurations of a host of different parts, these spaces became seas of identical cubicles. I've been thinking about the history of office architecture along the lines of the scientific process of carcinization, the very real and not at all made up by me, I promise, a process through which over long periods of time, many crustaceans have been observed to be evolving into the shape of a crab. Just like lobsters or prawns or crayfish or whatever other shellfish you can imagine, changing shape slowly over time, drawn to the seductive form of the crab, offices too seem to be drawn over time to the inescapable siren song of the open plan. This open officification, trademark pending, raises some key questions for the historian, scholar, designer, commentator, and/or user of office spaces. If we take architects and designers at their word, if we believe that they've been trying to improve the office for the last 100 years, why are we still stuck with the same overall kind of space used in 1904? What's happening to pull designs back to the open office? And why is the open office the design of choice? It's precisely these questions which my doctoral work, provisionally titled Where Do You Cry in an Open Plan Office?, attempts to answer. To provide answers, my research turns to the underlying element of the office which has stayed the most static over the past 130 years, which, essentially boiling down this 100,000-word dissertation into a few words, is capitalism. The office of 1904, my dissertation argues, looks a whole lot like the office of 2024 because work in 1904 looked a whole lot like work in 2024. While specific work tasks may have changed, while we may be typing instead of handwriting, Slack messaging instead of phone calling, the underlying reasons why we work and the overarching power dynamics within the workplace remain the same. Just like in 1904, bosses still dictate what work should be done, who should do it, in what time frame, to what degree of quality, and for what sort of financial compensation and reward. If my work is correct, and of course I'm biased here, but I really think it is, the influence of work on the office means that in order to understand the office, we have to understand work. So here's a very basic little work 101. We live and work within a capitalist economic system. Capitalism operates by paying workers a wage in exchange for their labor. But, and this is super important, within capitalism, workers are not paid the entire value of their labor. A portion of the value of their work, of our work, of your work, is siphoned away from us and confiscated by management, by the company we work for, and by the owner or owners of the company. Work within capitalism exists to generate profit for companies and capitalists. This means that offices and factories, the spaces in which work takes place, are the physical space in which these profits are generated. Even the specific work tasks which are undertaken within the office are not necessary in and of themselves. Workers don't have to just randomly and indiscriminately fill out forms, type emails, write lines of code, make phone calls, populate spreadsheets, or anything else for that matter. They have to do all of these particular tasks toward one specific end, toward the end of generating profit for the company they work for. Offices, in other words, are machines for working in. They're spaces whose entire being is oriented around capitalist structured work. Just like Corbusier's insistence that the house was a machine whose entire function should be based around creating an ease of modern living, the office is a machine whose reason for existing is to create profit. So this is the point where things get a little messy, and I might sound a little like the character Charlie from the TV show It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, mapping out crazy connections between things on a bulletin board feverishly with red thread and manic circles. But I hope you'll stay with me because I promise all of this is super relevant and important for your work and practice. Generation of profit as the core goal of the office helps explain why the architecture and design of the office has changed so little in the past 130 years. Office architecture has stayed the same because the needs of capital to generate profit has stayed the same. The underlying inescapable role of the office as a tool, as a machine to generate profit, means that it's always in management's best interest to shape the very foundation of how these spaces are understood, what is defined as possible in terms of their design, and the physical realization of designs, ensuring that the space will continue to contribute to increased work and increased income. While architects are placing windows and positioning interior walls, while designers are selecting desks and generating floor plans, capitalism is also working away on office design, setting basic assumptions about what office spaces are, should, and can be, setting large-scale design parameters, and dictating what, at the end of the day, office spaces do. After designs are implemented, after architects and designers have left the project, the forces of capitalism continue to work, molding and directing architecture and design towards the needs of corporate management, taking down walls in order to better observe and dictate, placing managers in private spaces befitting their positions within the company, and slowly but surely shaving off square footage per worker to save money and fit more employees in a smaller space. Understanding the office as a machine for working in also helps shed light on why the open office floor plan seems to be the design which gets rehashed and reused time and time again. The open office must continue to be used because capitalism believes this particular design best fulfills its need and best generates profit. The open office allows for managers to easily observe their employees, seeing what they're doing and how they're doing it, and providing easy access to dictate how work should be done. The open office is desirable not because technology workers must necessarily communicate constantly and in person, nor because it's just simply the most cost-efficient way of situating workers, because that's arguable that it may not be in the end, but instead because this particular design of the open office best enables management to observe and dictate how work is done. The open office also has the perk for management of reminding workers constantly and through tangible means of their place, quite literally, within capitalism. Out in the open office, workers are perpetually reminded that they're in a workspace, in a space which disallows undertaking all non-work related tasks. The open office, the open design reminds us, is not a place to be human, it's just a place to work. And this is where, as a side note, my dissertation gets its title, Where Do You Cry in an Open Plan Office? A question I found myself asking time and time again during my decade or so of working in nonprofit fundraising seated within an open plan. Try as I might, I just couldn't find a physical space in the office where I felt comfortable crying, laughing, calling a friend, or doing any sort of personal task that wasn't related to work. And so as we're starting to wind down, this is the part of the lecture where I finally get to the so what of all of this, what the influence over capitalism over 120 years of office history means for you as designers, for your practice, for your work, and for your designs. Ultimately, no matter how pervasive capitalism is, no matter how strong of an influence it exerts over the workplace, at the end of the day, each and every terrible, soulless office exists because someone designed it. This sort of space cannot continue to be built or redesigned if architects and interior designers refuse to be involved in this sort of project. I think architect and Yale professor emerita Peggy Deemer most powerfully describes the position of architects and designers in relationship to terrible spaces best. Deemer tells us that work one does not believe in can't get done if we refuse to do it. Refuse to design prisons, refuse to design detention centers, refuse to design border walls, and I would add, refuse to design dehumanizing open plan offices. As Deemer concludes, just refuse to do work you do not believe in. Of course, I acknowledge this isn't always the most easy to follow advice, particularly for young designers and architects at the beginning of their careers, who have little choice in the firms they work for, the projects they take on, and the larger scale design parameters of projects. But don't worry, Peggy Deemer has more advice for us to help develop a practice strong enough to create good places and spaces in a bad system. Deemer tells us that ethical architecture profession cannot avoid taking political positions. An ethical architectural or design practice needs to take a stand not just against specific design details of office buildings, but against the whole system from which these designs are birthed and replicated. An ethical practice needs to take a stand in relation to large-scale underlying forces which shape the parameters of what designs are possible and which have the power to alter designs after implementation. An ethical practice needs to tackle these issues head-on, acknowledging how they're influencing and might influence designs, reflecting on what is and what is not within the architect or designer's power to control. Because it's the lack of political involvement and a history of seeing the problems within office spaces as exclusively architectural rather than political, which explains in large part why, despite decades of hard work and effort and well-intentions of so many architects and designers, we see so little progress made towards truly comfortable worker-centered office spaces. Action office designer Robert Propst believed that the problems of office spaces lay entirely within design, that what was needed to fix the office was simply a better design made by a better designer. So this is exactly what he did. He created new physical objects, new designs, and plopped them, quite uncritically, into the already existing world of capitalist work. And as history has shown us, Propst was wrong in his approach. His design was not enough to reinvent or revolutionize the office. It may have, in fact, made the office worse. But the sort of politically based ethical practice that Peggy Deemer advocates suggests, in contrast to Propst's idealism, that design-based interventions to the office have failed because they're treating a symptom instead of a disease. They're attempting to fix tangible physical problems caused by capitalism without acknowledging, addressing, or attempting to fight capitalism itself. And in doing this, designers like props are essentially putting a plaster over a gaping flesh wound, something that is just not going to work. I think everything I've covered in the last 35 minutes or so can be boiled down to the importance of generating a truly critical practice in design, a practice that takes time and resources to really carefully examine what you're doing, why you're doing it, and for whom or to what ends you are working. Ethical practice in terms of office design necessitates asking, who is the client? Who are you designing for? Whose needs are you considering? And what needs or wants are not included in the brief at all, but maybe should be? An ethical practice also needs to ask what assumptions are made in the brief. What starting points are you working from? What sort of proof or evidence have been provided to support these claims? And what sort of proof or evidence can you find on your own? An ethical practice needs to consider all the whys of the questions I've just asked. Why is the client who they are? What does it mean for the project as a whole? Why are these assumptions being made? Why haven't you been provided with all the tools and information you need to do your job really well? Finally, an ethical practice has to situate itself within all of this, asking what you as a designer are or are not doing to make the lives of people using your spaces better or worse, and to be deeply honest about this. On this note, I'll end with a hopefully uplifting and motivating example of a very different sort of office, shaped by a very different sort of practice. That's the headquarters of German pen and office supply company Edding. At Edding, all workstations are the same size and configuration, from the CEO all the way down to clerical staff. Each employee has their own private office with a door that closes and a window that opens. These private offices are situated around the perimeter of the building, with areas for communal work and meetings and kitchen facilities in the building's interior core. Edding has been using this building for about over 3 decades now, and the company hasn't yet had any large issues with productivity or profit generation. Despite working in private spaces, employees seemingly are still able to get complicated contemporary office work done. Despite the cost of providing each employee with a substantial amount of space and the cost involved in giving each worker a privately controlled window, the company is still able to make money. Clearly then, the open office isn't the only way we can go. It's not the only design we can use for offices, and it isn't even the only design which can work within capitalism to make a profit. It's just the one that capitalism seems to prefer. And it's not a coincidence here that the Edding building, which values individual privacy, provides substantial room for each employee, and treats all workers equally, was designed and developed in Northern Europe, Germany in particular. Germany is a country which, until quite recently, not only had very strong unions advocating for the rights, needs, and wants of workers, but also until recently required by law that companies and architects consult and work with unions in the design of office spaces. At Edding, alongside many other office buildings in Northern Europe, the forces of capitalism shaping office design have been countered, at least to some degree, by a more ethical design practice which has been forced to consider factors beyond the aesthetic and forced to work with partners and unions to create better, more humane office spaces. Thank you so much for listening to me during this presentation. I'll end with a short list of further reading if you're interested in office design or these sort of ideas around labor and capitalism and value up on the screen, and I look forward to your questions.